So we are going to move into our next session, which is our final session of the day, which is going to focus on work-life balance, which I know was touched on a little bit in our first session. I am going to introduce our host, which is Angela Doig, from a project manager from Graham Construction. Welcome, Angela. If you could come in and introduce our speaker, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Angela, and I'm super excited to introduce Dawn Bloomer, who's our next speaker. She's a professional business strategist who specializes in helping professionals and entrepreneurs achieve peak performance through her productive pressure approach. It's an approach that recognizes pressure is not necessarily a bad thing. It's needed to push individuals to achieve their potential, but it needs to be the right amount to prevent burnout. As I'm sure many of us on this call have experienced, either going through burnout or being close to burnout. I, for one, am super excited to hear about Dawn's experiences with bouncing back from burnout and also just how to prevent it from occurring in the first place. So welcome, Dawn.
Thank you so much, Angela, for the great introduction. I'm really excited to be here today to share my perspective about a topic that's received a lot of press, and it's actually come up a lot in the session today. So a lot of great points came up earlier, and I haven't been able to incorporate them all, but hopefully I'll touch on some things that will add to this great conversation. I'd really like to reframe this idea of work-life balance as a work-life conversation. I'll touch briefly on the what and the why and share a little bit of my personal journey. I'll get a little vulnerable and then dig into the how and how we can address this. At the end, we should have plenty of time for questions. So please share anything you think of as we go along, and the moderators will collect them and we'll try to get to them at the end. You know, this concept of work-life balance emerged as early as the 18th and 19th centuries as the Industrial Revolution came about. And over time, our understanding of what this means has changed and the emphasis has evolved. The term work-life balance itself gained popularity in the late 20th century as a way to sort of encapsulate this idea of achieving some kind of equilibrium between your personal and professional lives. And since then, it's continued to evolve. And today it's widely discussed in issues about workplace policies, employee well-being, and organizational culture. And as we heard earlier today, work-life balance in the construction industry presents some unique challenges due to the nature of the work, which, as you know, often involves long hours and physical demands, seasonal variability, travel and moving around, safety concerns, shift work, and irregular hours. And yet somehow in all of this, you're supposed to balance all of that with your family and personal commitments. It's no wonder that, as Angela pointed out, burnout is not uncommon in the construction industry. It's essential that we consider both our personal life and our work life, or what I like to call just life, in order to achieve sustained success and personal fulfillment over time. And I love this visual of the wheel of life because it makes it so obvious that there's so much more to the conversation about work-life balance than just work and life. Depending on what phase of your life you're in, the areas you include on your wheel might be different. In fact, I now use this tool regularly, at least once a year, to reevaluate how I'm feeling about how I'm spending my time and energy at any given point. But this concept of achieving work-life balance is not just a personal responsibility, nor is it a luxury. It's truly a necessity for a sustainable life well lived. Statistics show that if we get this right, we can expect better mental and physical well-being, decreased stress, increased job satisfaction, and even increased productivity. And it's not hard to see that in the work environment, this is a win-win for both the employer and the employee. So why then do we struggle so much to achieve work-life balance? Well, keeping in mind the visual of the wheel of life, I think it becomes clear why chasing this paradigm of work-life balance is futile. If you have work on one side and life on the other side of the seesaw, and there's just no way to really balance it. It's virtually impossible to balance that equation. So you're just setting yourself up for failure. And I did this for years. The key is to reframe our expectations. And there's been a lot of talk today about expectations, but we need to reframe our expectations around what work-life balance should look like. And then create habits, systems, and even policies that support a whole life, while understanding that moment by moment, balance isn't even the goal. And that's why I believe work-life balance is BS. And I take this stance not just because I spent decades chasing that elusive unicorn that was supposed to be work-life balance. I truly believe there's a better and far more attainable goal. I like to think of it as work-life flow. Even if you've never been whitewater rafting, you probably know that there are parts of the river that are smooth and flow gently along. And as you float downstream, you eventually hit some rapids, usually just before you get launched over a waterfall. And you have to hang on, everyone's hanging on, paddles are flying, and you're just trying to stay afloat. And this pattern repeats itself over and over again as you go down the river. And as hair-raising as it can be in those moments of turbulence, it's really exhilarating. And to me, this is what work-life flow should feel like. We're going to have periods of time when we're under more pressure than others, but if we set the expectation and we learn how to manage these periods of greater demand, they can actually be enjoyable because they're really just part of the journey. When we can get into trouble is when we set unrealistic expectations, there's that word again, or we have no awareness of whether we've aligned our actions with what's important to us at that moment in time. When we're doing something that's aligned with our desired outcome, it really changes the game. But first, you actually need to know what you want. What is your desired outcome? So I'm going to share with you part of my personal story to give you some background on how I came to these conclusions and what made me decide that I really needed to make some serious life changes. For more than 20 years, I was a veterinarian for racehorses and a business owner. I wanted to be a horse doctor from the time I was 6, and I started learning how to ride. And I was fortunate enough to really achieve more in my career than I ever could have imagined possible. And I think the thing to really keep in mind is that from an outsider's perspective, I looked like I was very successful. But at some point, I realized that my life was in the toilet. And when I say this, it was actually in the toilet. The sign on this slide was on the inside of the stall door in the barn bathroom that had become my personal hideout. I spent more time than would probably be considered natural, sitting on the throne and journaling on my iPhone about how if I could just get through the next 12 days that I had to work straight, things would surely get better. And you might wonder how I ended up in this place at what most would have considered the pinnacle of my career. I certainly did, because it wasn't always this way. You know, not unlike the construction industry, the racetrack was and still is a male-dominated field. And although women are making great headway, they still, especially in the veterinary aspect of the racing industry, they still don't call it the sport of kings for nothing. And in my early days, I loved proving that I could outwork anyone, and I did anything I could to gain the respect of my peers and my clients. I worked 6 to 7 days a week. I was on call 24/7, and I wore my pager like a badge of courage, and I loved it. Fast forward a few years, I was on my second marriage and getting ready to have my first child when I was invited to buy into the business. Now, this had been a lifelong dream of mine, and I was thrilled. I knew that most of the women in my position left the racetrack after having their first child because they couldn't make it all work, but I was determined to overcome. I worked until I went into labor. Thought that I was just finally having that back pain they talk about, but not so. I was actually in labor. And then I came back 3 weeks later with my newborn and my nanny in tow. I set up a room in one of the barns as, like a nursery for when my son Jack and my nanny weren't in the truck with me. Jack came to view the barn as his personal playground, as you can see from the picture. And at this point, I was now a full partner in our business. So I'd added all that responsibility onto the challenges of being a new mom. And instead of deliberately making room for these new aspects of my life, the idea of just continually adding things on to my already overloaded plate became a theme. Fast forward a couple more years, and I repeated the process with my daughter, Emma. This time, though, I took it up a notch. I mean, having 2 kids in the truck and a very small room at the barn would be a lot, right? So I did the obvious. I bought an RV and I parked it at the racetrack so I could have the kids and nanny close by, and they would have more room and all the amenities. Of course, it also meant that I had to basically stock an entirely new facility and have diapers, bottles, clothes, et cetera, in multiple locations. But I kept telling myself, these are all first world problems, right? People would love to have the kind of problems that I had. At some point, though, I realized that even so, I needed to make some changes. The way I was living wasn't sustainable. And in fact, my second marriage didn't survive my lack of work-life balance. And I ended up navigating my second divorce while finishing my MBA, selling our home, buying another and renovating it so I could move in with my 2 small children, all while working and trying full-time and trying to grow a business. I'd added and added and added pressure to the system until I finally burned out. And that's when I ended up in the toilet. Like I said, first world problems, but problems all the same. How did I pull myself out of this place? As Angela mentioned, I think it's important to say I came out the other side. I had to make some really big changes. And the first and arguably hardest step for me was asking for help. And a number of people spoke earlier about this idea of having a good support system. My family is all back in Canada. I live in California. I didn't have any family as my support system. I did have some friends, but most of them were also working moms, and I didn't feel like I could really impose upon them. But I learned to ask for help, and creating community and bringing people in was the first step to really acknowledging that I didn't have it all under control. Once I got better at that, I was able to learn how to apply that old adage of putting the oxygen mask on myself first. I never really saw myself as a martyr, but I had inadvertently become one. And it wasn't necessary, and it definitely wasn't attractive. I had to learn how to set boundaries, which has come up quite a bit today. And I learned how to say no, or at the very least, no for now. I realized that you teach the behavior you tolerate. So I became intolerant of behavior that didn't support my new way of being. I learned how to delegate, automate, and eliminate activities to free up my time for things that really needed my attention, both at work and at home. And another toughie, I had to ditch my perfectionist tendencies and embrace the idea that most of the time, done is better than perfect. I'll tell you that none of this felt easy. Time blocking. I think this whole conversation around time versus energy is fascinating because we get so focused on time management. And there's something to be said for it for sure. And I became all about time blocking. I'd worked in an environment where someone always needed something, and I was really great at triage for everyone but myself. And I learned that I needed to be aware of my energy throughout the day and the week and plan my tasks accordingly as much as possible. Leslie talked about this, about, going to the gym first thing in the morning, about she needs to respond to emails early before the phone starts ringing. And it's important for you to be aware of what those those things are and how you can leverage your time and energy better. You know, everyone has the same amount of time available, and yet some people get so much more done. I came to realize that the most productive people focus more on leveraging their energy for certain tasks that require more focus or creativity, rather than just focusing on time management. I also came to see that productivity isn't really about just trying to jam more stuff into the day. I always thought that, being more productive meant you got more stuff done in the day, but it's really about using your energy wisely so that you can get more done more efficiently and free up time to do things you wouldn't get to do otherwise. And sometimes that means free time, hopefully for self-care and other things that you weren't doing before. If you can't tell, I've gone a little deep on all this. I've really gone down the rabbit hole of personal effectiveness, and I could talk about tips and tactics for this all day long. And sometimes I do. But embracing these skills and habits has truly been a game changer for me. So now that you've heard all of the perils of ignoring the need for work-life flow, let's talk about what all this means to employees and employers. Because one of the things I was tasked with today was trying to bring together some ideas about what employers and employees can do to bring these concepts into the workplace. We need to agree, first of all, and I know that this is a women in construction conference, and with all that in mind, we still need to agree that work-life flow is a gender-neutral need. There are definitely gender differences. I mean, I got to say, I don't remember having any male colleagues who needed to find a quiet, clean place to pump so they could feed their newborn baby. But the need itself for work-life flow is gender neutral. And this actually works to our advantage as women. If we can promote this idea that work-life flow isn't just, or work-life balance as it's more commonly known, is not just for women, it's easier for us to get traction getting the problem solved, because let's face it, there are still more men in our workplace. In fact, in the affinity group conversation earlier, Michelle mentioned that much of the positive change that's being driven through women's affinity groups is beneficial to all. Part of what makes work-life flow challenging to manage for employers is also what makes it hard for employees to achieve. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Each individual has different needs and wants, depending on a variety of factors. Think back to our wheel of life. Everybody's wheel of life is going to look a little different, and everybody's priorities will be a little bit different. And these factors usually change over time and as their roles change, both at work and at home. And the only way we can reconcile these challenges is to share the responsibility for the solutions. Both the employer and the employee play an important role in finding common ground. Now, unlike Louisa, I am not an attorney and I don't play one on TV. So there may be some instances where local or federal laws dictate some of the HR policies that are related to some of the things we're talking about. But what we're discussing today are ways that both the employer and the employees can come to the table and help each other get what they need. In order for an employer to help support their employees, it's important that they start by opening a dialogue. Getting clarity as an individual has to be the first step. If you don't know what you want, how are you going to ask for it? And how are you going to suggest solutions? It seems obvious, but until the employer and the employees can have an understanding of what some of the common challenges are, only then can you move on to the next stage. And often this is about creating surveys and holding meetings to discover and drill down on what the stakeholder needs really are and what some of the solutions could be. But don't skip that first step, because if you aren't having the conversations first and you start looking for solutions or even surveying for input without understanding the common threads of the challenges, you may spend a lot of time and money chasing solutions that don't actually solve the problems. So once you've done that, you can't stop there. You have to take action. as an employer, if there are any employers out there listening, as an employer, the worst thing you can do is to have conversations and do surveys and act interested in what the employees have to say, and then do nothing. Because then your employees feel like not only have they voiced their concerns, but they've been completely ignored. So make sure that from there, you're implementing, you're supporting the employees and making sure they understand how they can access whatever you put in place. Leslie this morning mentioned making it easy for potential employees to get information about your company, not just the role when you're trying to recruit. The same applies by making these policies and programs visible and showing what your company culture is about. It won't just help you internally, it will also help you externally as you're trying to recruit. And then please make a plan, put it on the calendar to revisit these policies and programs on a regular basis. This is not a one-time set it and forget it process. You need to get continuous feedback to make sure that what you are giving is what it was perceived to be and that it's useful. And this process requires really good leadership. There are some specific ways that the leadership needs to act in order for this to really work. It starts, of course, with creating programs and policies that intentionally incorporate the input that you've received from all the other steps we just talked about. But beyond that, and I really want to stress this, leaders must be good role models. They must practice what they preach. If you're sending emails at 9 o'clock at night and staying until 8 o'clock if the job site closed at 5, and you told your employees that they should set boundaries, it doesn't really work. And I say this because if employees feel that their supervisor or leader doesn't believe in the policies or programs, then they might fear that they're going to be overlooked for promotions or labeled as weak or not engaged if they ask for help or if they set those boundaries and keep them. Another thing is if you ask your employees, you tell them that they should ask for help when they need something, and then they come to you with something like, let's say they want time off for their best friend's wedding, and you scoff and, oh, that's not really that important. And then when they need to come to you for something that's more sensitive that they need support on, they may not feel comfortable. It's so important to create a culture that is in alignment with what you're offering. So again, this concept of culture has come up several times today, and this idea of being in alignment with your company values is key in this process. You can't always be making exceptions to the rule, but we've talked quite a bit today about flexibility and the importance of flexibility for our employees. And developing programs with the stakeholders' concerns in mind is important because you don't want to spend time and money on things that people don't care about. Once you've done this, make sure that you're communicating what you've provided and how they can access it so that you can get your programs adopted and used. You've spent a lot of time and effort and energy getting this done. It's really common for people not to leverage the programs you offer because they simply haven't learned how to access the website, for example. So remove the friction and make it easy. Provide a way for your employees to feel safe when they're sharing information that may be personal in nature, or they may just feel awkward about sharing. Creating this sense of psychological safety can really go a long way to helping team members feel comfortable about asking for what they need. Make it so that they don't have to necessarily come to you to get what they need. Maybe they can go to a website and access support through that without having to bring it to your attention and have them feel like they're being singled out and getting attention that they don't really want. So we talked quite a bit about the employer's role. Let's talk about the employee's place in all of this because you have such an important role as an employee. The first and most important thing when an employee is advocating for what they need is to explain the impact of your request. Take a solution-oriented approach. There was some conversation earlier when we were talking about the affinity groups about not focusing on the negative all the time and making sure that there's some positivity brought into it. This is an awesome place for you to bring your ideas forward and say, look, this is how we can solve for this. So when you come offering a solution to your employer, it's much harder for them to turn you down. Make it easy for them to accommodate you. What do you need? Assuming your request is reasonable and falls within the policies that have already been created, you shouldn't be required to provide a lot of sensitive detail. Be clear on the timing for your request. When do you need this by? Is this an urgent concern? Or is this something that's like a what if? Well, what if this happens and you just kind of want to give them a heads up so you know what the options will be if this comes to pass? If you're really, really struggling and you need help now, be clear about it. And if it's something that's going to be a concern, is it time bound or is it sort of a one-off request? Because these things will factor into whether or not it gets approved, how they accommodate you. Like if you need time off for an annual physical exam versus you need to have, for example, 6 physical therapy sessions, it's a lot easier if you're upfront about what your needs are. And again, just a reminder to be solution-oriented and make it easy for your employer to say yes. If you're asking for something outside of the regular policies, consider explaining your why, because it can make your argument more compelling. I remember as an employee thinking that, I remember an employee one time thinking that I had really explained myself well, but I really hadn't given a lot of details. So for example, saying you need time off for a funeral versus you need time off for your mother's funeral and you have to drive 6 hours to get there and you're her only child and in charge of all the arrangements may make it a little easier for your employer to give more because they have a deeper understanding of what you're going through. I think another place where we get a little caught up sometimes is, there are 2 sides to every conversation. And I can remember as an employee thinking I got approval for time off for something that was important to me, only to find out that my employer didn't even remember having the conversation. On the flip side, as an employer, I remember a long-term employee who used to always love to ask me for time off when we were in the middle of, or whatever he needed, when we were in the middle of some sort of a procedure. And I'd always say, something along the lines of, I'm sure we can probably make that work out, but will you check out with me? And what they took away from that was, yes, but, fair enough. But then they'd run with it. And of course, I would forget and it would all go downhill from there. This is another reason to always assume best intentions. Oftentimes we make up a story in our head about where someone's coming from, and this creates a whole other level of stress and frustration. Your supervisor or your employer may just not have gotten the memo, so to speak. So be proactive and keep following up. So really there is this whole process, and it involves an awareness of what you need as an individual, and for the employer, an awareness of what your team members need as a collective. What are the most common issues? How can you implement programs and processes? But having these ongoing conversations is key. This is the only way that you're going to get an outcome that is good for both sides and then come to an agreement. And agreements are so much better than expectations. Agreements are both parties coming together and saying, yes, this is what we've said we're going to do, and we're good with it. And then follow up. Iterate, 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 do it, and then come back and revisit it. Don't just say, okay, woo, we did that, great. We've got these programs in place. We're all good, because over time, things will change. Just think how different things were pre and post pandemic. So really the big takeaway in this idea is there's this whole work-life conversation. This is about getting flow over balance and figuring out how to get all of the things that are going to make you a stronger, better, whole person. And for employers, make your teams more productive and happier and healthier. It does need to be a somewhat personalized approach, but that doesn't mean that you can't have programs in place that are available across the board. But you need to be prepared that there are going to be some people's situation that will not quite fit in the buckets you've created. And then keep in mind that this is a human challenge. We need to advocate for everyone. Everyone has the right and the need for this work-life flow. and having a whole and complete life. So please, after we do our Q&A, it's important that you go back to your organizations and have a discussion. If having enough information alone was the solution to transformation, we'd all have six-pack abs and be billionaires. Take action, have conversations, create a support network, join an affinity group, speak up, as it was pointed out earlier, if you see actions that are not in alignment with your organization's values. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Angela for some Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dawn. Definitely appreciate you telling a little bit of your story. It sounds like a pretty crazy life with lots of fun things to flow through. Biggest takeaway for me from your presentation is definitely that idea of there is no such thing as work-life balance, and just that emphasis on needing support from other people, because I think it's very difficult for a lot of people to admit that they need support from others, and everyone tries to solve problems on their own. So that was really great. I'm just going to remind everyone that's listening to the presentation, if you have any questions, bring them up, put them into the chat so we can make sure that we pass those over to Dawn so she can answer them. But in the meantime, I'm going to be a little bit selfish here because I have many questions for you. And the biggest thing for me that I'd like to know, just with this idea of energy management versus time management, which you talked a bit about there. I guess for you, what is energy management versus time management, or how do you find that you manage your energy?
Yeah, I think that this is a great topic, and you and I talked about it a little bit previously. I think for me, I have certain times of the day when I have more brain power for certain activities. I have certain times of the day or the week where I have more energy for doing physical things. So I like to start my day out, not unlike what Leslie spoke of earlier. I like to start my day out with working out because that gets me all fired up. And I do this whole like cold plunge hot tub thing and start the day. And then I know that I can do my best. And I hope if any of my clients are listening, it doesn't mean my work later in the day isn't great, but I can do some of my most creative thinking earlier in the day when, when I'm fresh. And so I do tend to schedule and time block my days now in a way that supports that. So I do my more creative tasks usually earlier in the day. I tend to batch those kinds of tasks together so that I know that once I am able to get into that focused flow, again, the flow thing, I can really get engaged and take advantage of that flow and get more done in a shorter period of time. What about you? How do you use your energy?
Honestly, it's a very, very similar approach. We kind of talked about this a little bit before as well. Just some of the challenges in the construction industry in general is that things change 100 times throughout the day. So kind of having to be flexible to things that come up. So I definitely like to time block my day out, and I know which hours are my more productive hours, but then also just recognizing that your plan can go out the window pretty quick, and recognizing that if someone comes in and needs something, that's also part of your job to deal with it. So I do think there is a lot of guilt in people when they feel like they're not getting to the tasks that they need to, but recognizing that your job takes on many forms, and dealing with new things that are coming up is all part of your job as well. So it's definitely that ebb and flow. So
I think that's a really good point. I think that really feeds into what a number of people mentioned earlier today, which is this whole idea that that setting different expectations for yourself and for how things are going to happen is really key, right? Because if you think that every day is just going to be like, it's just all going to go according to plan, it's all going to be lovely, well, you're going to be disappointed on the regular. And I think that's what happened to me throughout my career, is that I kept chasing this whole idea. I'm like, I'm supposed to have balance. I should be able to keep it all evened out. And I could never get it done. I never was able to master it. And so I think that it's a really important idea to embrace, is this idea that it's going to be it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be different all the time. There are
For
things
sure.
you can do, and then stuff happens, right?
Yeah. Is there things that you do kind of outside of your work hours that help you to be more productive at work, or to kind of manage your energy, like things? Because it's like you say, it's pretty hard to picture just your work hours as your work hours, and everything kind of flows into that. So how you spend your time outside of work is going to affect how you do things at work and how you react to things. So is there certain things you do outside of your work hours that help you?
Yes, that's a great question. So one of the first things that that I focused on when I was sort of, trying to pull myself out of the toilet is I focused on getting more sleep. I had gone for decades, uh, literally living on, 4.5. If I would had a really good night's sleep, it might be 5 hours of sleep, because I was just trying to jam so much into the day. And as soon as I started prioritizing sleep, it did an interesting thing. Even though I wasn't doing, I didn't seem to have as many hours available to do things in the day, I had more energy. And so when I was doing things, I had more energy for all the things I needed to do. So that was the number one thing that I did, was sleep. And so I track my sleep. I have an Aura ring, and I track my sleep. I prioritize it. I make sure that I try to go to bed at the same time every day, get up at the same time. So that was my number one, was prioritizing sleep. And I also have, and we talked about this a little bit, I have become much better at boundaries. I've become much better at boundaries. Every once in a while I slip up, but even if I go to send an email in the evening, I try to schedule it for the next morning so that nobody can tell that I, sort of it's my own boundary, kind of worked outside of the rules. But I do try to have I do try to have a workday shutdown ritual. It's actually almost harder for me now than it was before, because I spend a lot of my time working from home now, and I can just keep going and going, and I'm having fun, and I'm like, whoa, but wait a minute. So I try to have a ritual at the end of the day where I say, okay, it's time to move on to other things, and then get ready for the next part. I also use different personas depending on the time of my day. This is one that I learned from a CEO coach called Eric Partaker. He talks about the 3 alarms, and he sets 3 alarms every day. So he has 3 different personas. And so for me, it's sort of like my optimal longevity persona, where I work out and I do all these self-care kind of things. And I do that in the first part of the day. And then I put on my CEO persona, where I'm going to be, I'm going to kick ass at that all day. And then I put on my, best wife and mom thing at the end of the day, and try and embrace that. It doesn't always work. It's not always perfect, but just having the thought of it in my head has helped me quite a bit too.
Right. So you kind of split up your day in a way. You're focusing on whichever thing you need to focus at the time, so you're not getting too distracted by the other things.
It doesn't mean I don't multitask. I mean, I try not to, because I know it's not very efficient, but
right.
It's a hard thing to get past.
Yes, there is that mentality that women are good at multitasking, but yeah, I've seen a lot of things recently about there's no such thing as actually multitasking. You're just not actually putting all of your energy into the thing you need to be working on. So
Exactly.
It's definitely a challenge in that way.
Yes. I have a question for you, Angela, if you don't mind. What are some of the things that because you work for a very interesting company that is large, but employee owned. What are some of the things that you have implemented in order to help promote work-life balance in your organization? Or as we're now reframing it as work-life flow?
So yeah, it's pretty difficult in construction. Like, it's kind of been changing as things have gone along now, and now with the emphasis on everyone is available 24/7, you can always reach someone. It becomes a little bit more of a expectation that you can be reached and that you should be responding. So like you said, creating boundaries is a big thing. But as an organization, definitely there's been an increase in the emphasis on just kind of mental health and recognizing signs of burnout or stress, anxiety, that kind of thing, and trying to implement tools to help. And then also just a really big emphasis on leadership and mentorship, in the way of just trying to promote checking in with team members and not just pushing through. There's definitely a big like grind mentality in construction. So it's definitely been shifting a little bit to recognize that that's not the way to do things. And I do think there is a lot more burnout, like it's a lot more prevalent now. So it's not just out of it's out of the goodness of everyone's heart that they want people to do well, but from a business perspective as well. There was lots of conversation today about employee retention, that kind of thing. If a company doesn't have the right processes in place to deal with this, then we are seeing a lot of turnover in construction in general, just because there isn't the same mentality of just pushing through and work being your entire life, really. So that's a big thing that I've seen.
That's great. That's great.
And I do think too, there's a lot more emphasis now, especially in construction. Things are very project-based, so there's always ebbs and flows of your busy season and your down season, but there has been a lot more emphasis now, I think, on taking breaks continuously, not just waiting until there's a break from the busy time. So it's definitely changed in that way, which is very positive to see.
That's great.
I guess in your experience, because there is a bit of a difference between dealing with energy management, time management as an employer or being a business owner when it's kind of all on your back versus being as an employee when you're not running your own business. You can't kind of dictate how things are going to change necessarily. So you talked a lot about communication and bringing things up early, that kind of thing, which I think is very important. Like you said, if you bring it up too late, it's a lot harder to handle it. What advice would you have to someone that's maybe, let's say, more junior in a company that's starting to feel these things, to feel comfortable bringing these things up?
That was a problem for me when I was an employee. I was afraid to, bring any of these things up in case in case they decided they didn't want to make me a partner. I'd always wanted to be a partner, and I thought, but really, I think the big skill to learn for this, and it's something that can serve us well in all areas of our life, is learning how to have what are perceived as difficult conversations. And the more you practice them, the easier they get, because most of the time they aren't nearly as hard as you think they're going to be. And frankly, carrying around that burden of whatever it is that you want to get across but feel that you can't is so much harder than just getting it out and then seeing what happens. In the absence of information, people will make up their own story. And if you're carrying that around and not sharing it, it comes out in various ways. People can sense that there's something not right, but you haven't shared it, and so they don't know what it is. So they'll make up their own story. So I would say number one is find someone, there was a lot of talk today about sponsorship and allyship and, how do we find ways to support each other through this journey, especially as women in a male-dominated field. And I think that finding people that you feel safe talking to is a great place to start. And then just practicing. The more you have those conversations, the easier they get. And the one thing about employers, from an employer perspective, if you give an employer enough runway and you have a compelling argument, especially if you have a solution, it's really hard not to make that happen. Right. It's really hard for the employer to turn you down at that point.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. It definitely takes a lot of courage, but I've heard a quote going around a lot lately. It's easier to deal with an issue than to not deal with an issue. And
yes,
your body, if you do not take the break that you need, your body will take it for you. And that's when you end up in the toilet, as you said. So
don't do what I did. They say, what would so-and-so do? What would Dawn do? No, don't do what Dawn did.
Right.
Don't do that. Don't wait.
So we're just about out of time here, but there is one more question that came through that I think is a really good question. Just to flip on the question I asked earlier about how you do things in your personal life to help with your work life. What are things that you do at work to help in your personal life?
I think that one of the things I do is that it's easier for me now because my kids are older. I have a son in college. My son's in college and my daughter's, a junior in high school. So I don't have little kids running around especially while I'm working at home. But what I do is I really try to set expectations, and I make agreements because I prefer agreements to expectations, but I really try and set myself up for success by making sure that everyone around me knows what I'm doing while I'm at work and when I'll be available. So I'm not constantly getting incoming requests for things that could really wait until later. That whole thing I said earlier, one of the most valuable things I learned is that you teach the behavior you tolerate. So if you let people interrupt you all day, they will continue to do so. In some instances, you can't help it. You have to let them interrupt you. But if you don't, it's okay to say, you know what? That's great, but can we save that for later? Because right now I've got this going on. But it's even easier if you've already set that bar and people know you've already communicated that. I think the other thing is that I do spend time making sure that the people around me who are supporting me and what I'm trying to do understand what work means for me, and so they can help support me in that. A lot of this is really about communication. It's about having difficult conversations. It's about saying, you know what, I really want to help you with that, and right now I can't. So learning to say no for me has been a big thing, both at work and at home. And it's a great skill. Hard, but good.
You're right. It's very difficult. It's like you said, boundaries. There's boundaries in everything.
Boundaries. Yeah.
Boundaries and communication. That's the two biggest takeaways that I got from today.
Yeah. I tell a story about how I used to, pretty much work and live out of my truck. And I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that can relate to this. And so my truck was like a fishbowl, and I'd be in there, like trying to eat my lunch or something because I had 5 minutes, and people would come and they'd knock on my window, or they'd open my door, or my personal favorite, they'd like press their face up against the window going, so I had no boundaries. So it's been a journey. But
that's when you started locking the door.
That's when I started locking the door and rolling the window up,
or hiding
out in the bathroom and hiding in the,
Sure. Right on. Well, we've come to the end here. We're out of time for questions here, but thank you so much for sharing your presentation today. And I, for one, have a lot of points that came out of that to try and implement more in my own work-life flow. So thank you so much, Dawn, and I'll pass it back to you, Danielle, to close it up.
Thank you. Thanks, Angela and Dawn. That was it's really good. I think it's a reminder why these conversations are so important, right? Because there's so many of us who think we're the only ones feeling a certain way. And then so, Dawn, thank you for sharing your story with us.